Every child deserves to feel protected, but in the dusty frontier town of Millbrook, young Clara faced such cruelty alone. When local children cruelly mocked her worn boots and untied shoelaces, no one expected the wealthiest ranch owner to kneel and help her. Elijah McGraw kept to himself, but something about Clara stirred buried memories. As whispers spread through dusty streets about why a rich cowboy would humble himself for a struggling black girl, tensions began rising. Clara's mother worked tirelessly to keep their family together, unaware this mysterious act would change everything. What Clara didn't know was that Elijah carried a secret connection to her late father, a truth that would shake their small community. His simple gesture would unravel decades of buried guilt, hidden relationships, and force everyone to question what true wealth really means. But what was Elijah's connection to Clara's family that haunted him so deeply? The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's main street as Ruth Henderson bent over her sewing machine, squinting in the dim light filtering through the cracked window of their small room above Peterson's general store. Her fingers worked steadily through the pale blue fabric, another dress for one of the wealthy rancher's wives who could afford such luxuries. The steady rhythm of the machine had become the soundtrack of their survival. "Mama, my shoe keeps coming loose," Clara called from the corner, where she sat practicing her letters on a slate board, salvaged from the old schoolhouse. Ruth glanced up, her heart tightening as she saw her 8-year-old daughter struggling with the worn leather boot that had belonged to 3 previous children before finding its way to Clara's feet. The sole had separated from the upper, and no amount of careful stitching seemed to hold it together for long. "Come here, sweetheart," Ruth said, setting down her work and patting her knee. Clara scrambled over, dragging the problematic boot. Behind her, as Ruth examined the damaged shoe, her gaze fell on the small wooden box sitting on the windowsill, the repository of their most precious possessions. Inside lay Samuel's military medal from his service in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, along with his discharge papers and the few letters he'd managed to send home during the war. The medal caught the morning light, its bronze surface, worn smooth by Ruth's fingers during the countless times she'd held it, remembering the man who'd earned it. Samuel Henderson had been a hero long before he'd become her husband. He'd fought at Fort Wagner and marched with Sherman to the sea, carrying the hopes of his people and the promise of a better future. When the war ended, he'd come west with dreams of land ownership and the chance to build something lasting for his family. Those dreams had seemed within reach when Samuel first arrived in Millbrook in 1875. The town was young then, carved out of the harsh Arizona territory by men who believed that determination and hard work could overcome any obstacle. Samuel had filed claims on good grazing land near Willow Creek and worked alongside other settlers to establish the community that would become their home. But the frontier had its own harsh arithmetic. Samuel's land had been rich with promise, but poor in immediate returns. While he struggled to build his ranch, other men with more capital and fewer scruples, had consolidated power and wealth. When the copper mine opened north of town, Samuel had taken work there to supplement their income, leaving before dawn and returning after sunset, his clothes red with ore dust and his hands permanently stained. It was at the mine that Samuel had died 3 years ago, trapped in a cave-in that had claimed 5 men. The official report blamed unstable geology and bad luck, but Ruth had heard whispers that safety precautions had been ignored to meet production quotas. The mining company had paid for the funerals and offered modest compensation to the widows, but the money had barely lasted a year. Now Ruth supported herself and Clara through her skill with needle and thread, taking in sewing from anyone who could pay. The wealthy ranch wives brought her their alterations and special occasion dresses, paying well enough to keep food on the table, but treating her with the careful politeness reserved for useful servants. The working women of Millbrook brought her their mending and practical garments, paying what they could and often throwing in a loaf of bread or a jar of preserves. "There," Ruth said, having managed to coax another few days of life from Clara's boot. "But we'll need to find you something better soon." Clara nodded solemnly, understanding far more about their circumstances than any child should have to. She was a bright girl, quick with numbers and letters, and she possessed an intuitive understanding of people that often surprised adults. Ruth sometimes caught glimpses of Samuel in their daughter's expressions, the same thoughtful eyes, the same gentle stubbornness when she'd made up her mind about something. "Mrs. Henderson?" a voice called from the stairway leading up from the store. "You have a customer." Ruth smoothed her skirts and descended to find Mrs. Catherine Morrison waiting with an armload of fabric. Mrs. Morrison was the wife of Elijah McGraw's ranch foreman, a kind woman who treated Ruth with genuine respect. "I need 3 work shirts for my husband," Mrs. Morrison said, "and Catherine Jr. has outgrown all her dresses again. That child shoots up like a weed." As they discussed measurements and timeline, Ruth found herself thinking about the McGraw ranch and its enigmatic owner. Elijah McGraw had arrived in Millbrook about 5 years ago, purchasing the largest ranch in the territory and immediately establishing himself as the area's most successful cattle baron. Unlike many wealthy men, McGraw paid his workers fairly and maintained his properties well. He attended church regularly, but spoke little, contributed generously to community causes, but always through intermediaries. The man himself remained a mystery. Ruth had seen him perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, always impeccably dressed, always polite, but distant. He was probably in his early 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. There was something in his eyes, a sadness or perhaps a weight, that made people instinctively give him space. "Mr. McGraw keeps to himself, doesn't he?" Ruth ventured as she wrote down Mrs. Morrison's specifications. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Morrison replied. "Been with him 2 years now, and I don't think I've had more than a dozen conversations with the man, but he's fair, I'll give him that. Pays better than anyone else in the territory, and when my youngest took sick last winter, he made sure Doc Williams saw him without worrying about the bill." After Mrs. Morrison left, Ruth returned to her sewing with a thoughtful expression. In a town where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, Elijah McGraw's ability to remain private was remarkable. It suggested either exceptional discipline or secrets worth keeping. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers and errands. Clara helped where she could, organizing thread spools and sweeping up scraps. Around 4 o'clock, they made their weekly trip to Peterson's general store for supplies. Pete Peterson was a decent man who extended credit when times were hard and never made his customers feel ashamed for needing help. His store occupied the ground floor of their building, filled with everything from horseshoe nails to fancy soaps ordered from San Francisco. "Afternoon, Ruth," Pete said, looking up from his inventory ledger. "How's business?" "Steady, thank the Lord," Ruth replied, producing her carefully prepared shopping list. "Mrs. Morrison brought me quite a bit of work today." As Pete gathered their supplies, Sheriff Jim Hayes entered with his usual friendly nod. Hayes was one of the few men in town who treated Ruth and Clara with the same easy courtesy he showed everyone else. He'd been Samuel's friend, and Ruth suspected he kept a watchful eye on them out of loyalty to that friendship. "Pete, you seen anything of McGraw today?" Hayes asked. "Had a wire from the territorial marshal about some cattle thieves working their way north. Wanted to make sure he knows to keep his boys alert." "Haven't seen him," Pete replied, "but his foreman Morrison was in this morning. Said McGraw's been riding the northern sections this week, checking on the herds personally." Hayes nodded, then noticed Clara examining a jar of peppermint sticks with obvious longing. Without fanfare, he reached into his pocket and placed a nickel on the counter. "Miss Clara here helped me find my dropped badge last week," he told Pete. "Seems like that deserves some appreciation." Clara's face lit up as Pete handed her 2 of the striped candies. Ruth felt the familiar mix of gratitude and embarrassment that came with such kindnesses. People in Millbrook looked after each other, but being on the receiving end of charity no matter how tactfully offered, reminded her daily of how precarious their position had become. As they walked home, Clara chattering happily about her unexpected treat, Ruth noticed a commotion near the schoolhouse. A group of children had gathered in a circle, and she could hear raised voices and laughter that had a cruel edge to it. "Stay close," she told Clara. But her daughter had already spotted the disturbance and was craning her neck to see what was happening. "It's Jenny Walsh," Clara said. "She looks upset." Ruth could see Jenny now, a thin girl of about 10 whose family lived in one of the ramshackle cabins near the defunct silver mine. Jenny's clothes were patched and repatched, and her shoes were even worse than Clara's. The other children, mostly from the more prosperous families, had formed a circle around her, pointing and laughing. "Look at those shoes," one boy called out. "They're more hole than shoe." "I bet she can't even afford shoelaces," added another. Ruth felt her anger rise, but before she could intervene, she noticed a lone figure on horseback watching the scene from across the street. Even at a distance, she recognized Elijah McGraw's silhouette, the straight back, the expensive hat, the quality of his mount and tack. For a moment, she thought he might ride on and pretend he hadn't seen the cruelty unfolding. But then McGraw dismounted, tied his horse to the hitching post, and walked purposefully toward the group of children. "That's enough," his voice carried clearly across the dusty space. The children scattered like startled birds, leaving Jenny standing alone with tears on her cheeks. McGraw knelt beside the girl, his voice too low for Ruth to hear the words, but she could see him examining Jenny's shoes with the same careful attention a doctor might give a patient. From his vest pocket he produced what looked like spare bootlaces, and with practiced efficiency, he repaired Jenny's footwear as best he could. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 3 minutes, but Ruth found herself unable to look away. There was something in McGraw's manner, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation for stern reserve, that struck her as familiar, though she couldn't place why. When he finished, McGraw helped Jenny to her feet, said something that made her smile, and watched as she ran home. Only then did he notice Ruth and Clara standing nearby. For a moment their eyes met across the street. McGraw touched the brim of his hat in a polite acknowledgement, then mounted his horse and rode away without another word. Why did he do that? "Mama?" Clara asked as they continued toward home. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, thinking about what she'd witnessed. "I think," she said finally, "that Mr. McGraw understands what it feels like to be different. Sometimes the kindest people are the ones who've known the most pain." That evening, as she helped Clara prepare for bed, Ruth found herself looking again at Samuel's medal in its place of honor on the windowsill. The bronze caught the lamplight, and for a moment she could almost see her husband's face reflected in its surface. The same gentle strength she'd glimpsed in Elijah McGraw's actions that afternoon. Something about the wealthy rancher tugged at her memory, like a word on the tip of her tongue that wouldn't quite form. She'd seen kindness like his before, but where? And why did his careful attention to a child's worn shoes remind her so strongly of Samuel's own gentle nature? Outside, the sounds of Millbrook settling into evening drifted through their windows. Dogs barking, horses nickering in the livery stable, the distant sound of piano music from the saloon. It was a good town, despite its flaws, populated by people trying to build something decent in a harsh land. But as Ruth finally blew out the lamp and settled into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the afternoon's encounter had set something in motion, something that would change their lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine. 3 days after witnessing Elijah McGraw's kindness to Jenny Walsh, Clara Henderson found herself the target of similar cruelty. The morning had started peacefully enough. Ruth had walked her to the schoolhouse as usual, kissing her forehead and reminding her to be careful with her patched dress. Miss Sarah Hartwell, the schoolteacher, had arranged the children in the small yard behind the building for their morning exercise when disaster struck. Clara had been attempting to skip rope when the inevitable happened. Her problematic boot finally gave up entirely. the sole flapping loose and catching in the rope, sending her tumbling to the hard-packed earth. "Oh no," Clara whispered, examining the damage. The boot was beyond even her mother's skilled repairs now, the leather upper completely separated from the sole. Worse, her shoelace had snapped in the fall, leaving her with no way to secure even the damaged footwear. "Look at Clara's shoe." Tommy Mitchell's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. The banker's son was 11 years old and possessed the particular cruelty that sometimes comes with privilege and parental indulgence. "It's falling apart." The other children gathered around, drawn by the commotion. Most were simply curious, but a few picked up Tommy's mocking tone. "How can she even walk in that?" asked Mary Whitman, the mercantile owner's daughter, wrinkling her nose in distaste. "Maybe her mama can't afford real shoes?" suggested Billy Harper, whose father ran the largest freight company in town. Clara felt her cheeks burning with shame as she tried unsuccessfully to hold her boot together. The broken shoelace dangled. Uselessly, and with each step, the sole flapped like a fish out of water. "I bet she doesn't even have another pair," Tommy continued, emboldened by the attention. "Poor people only get one of everything, don't they, Clara?" "That's not true," Clara said quietly, but her voice was barely audible above the growing murmur of commentary. "Then where are your other shoes?" Billy demanded. "Show us your fancy Sunday shoes." Clara stood frozen, unable to respond because, of course, there were no other shoes. These broken boots were her only pair, carefully maintained by her mother, but finally succumbing to months of wear and the particular demands of childhood. Miss Hartwell had stepped inside the schoolhouse to fetch something and remained unaware of the scene unfolding in the yard. The children formed a rough circle around Clara, their morning exercise forgotten in favor of this more entertaining spectacle. "Look how she just stands there," Tommy sneered. "Can't even defend herself. Maybe if she asks real nice, someone will give her some string to tie around her foot," Mary suggested, earning giggles from several other children. Clara felt tears, threatening, and blinked hard to hold them back. She'd learned early that crying only made things worse, that showing weakness invited more cruelty. But the humiliation of having her poverty exposed so publicly, of being the object of their amusement, was almost overwhelming. "I think she's going to cry," observed one of the younger boys. "Poor little Clara, with her broken shoes and no daddy too." "Buy her new ones," Tommy said, his voice taking on a sing-songy quality that made the words cut deeper. Across the street, Elijah McGraw had just finished conducting business at the assay office when the sound of children's laughter drew his attention. Something about the quality of that laughter, the edge of cruelty rather than genuine mirth, made him pause on the wooden sidewalk. He recognized the scene immediately, having witnessed too many similar incidents in his own childhood. A circle of children, voices raised in mock concern and genuine malice. A smaller figure at the center, bearing the brunt of their attention. His hand moved instinctively to the silver pocket watch in his vest, fingers tracing the engraved initials that had belonged to another man in another time. Through the gaps between the children, Elijah could see Clara Henderson struggling with her damaged boot. The sight hit him like a physical blow, memories rushing back unbidden. Another child, decades ago, in a different place but facing the same humiliation, the same desperate attempt to maintain dignity in the face of public shame. Samuel, he thought, recognizing Clara's stubborn pride as an echo of her father's character. Samuel, who had faced down Confederate artillery with the same quiet determination his daughter now showed in the face of schoolyard bullies. "She probably sleeps in those shoes," Tommy was saying, his audience now numbering nearly a dozen children. "Poor people don't have nightgowns or proper beds." That was enough. Elijah stepped off the sidewalk and crossed the street with long, purposeful strides. The sound of his boots on the hard ground was distinctive, the solid thunk of expensive leather on wooden heels that announced the presence of someone accustomed to authority. "That's quite enough," his voice carried clearly across the schoolyard, causing the circle of children to break apart as if scattered by a strong wind. "Tommy, Mitchell's face went pale as he recognized the tall figure approaching them. Elijah McGraw commanded respect throughout the territory, not just for his wealth, but for his reputation as a man who kept his word and expected others to do the same. "Mr. McGraw, sir," Tommy stammered, "we were just—" "I can see what you were doing," Elijah said quietly. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried an authority that made the remaining children step back instinctively. "I suggest you find something more constructive to occupy your time." The children scattered like leaves before a strong wind, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Within moments, only Clara remained in the yard, still holding her broken boot and looking up at the tall rancher with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. Elijah knelt beside her, bringing himself down to her level. Up close, the resemblance to Samuel was even more pronounced. The same dark eyes, the same bone structure, the same quiet dignity, even in distress. "May I?" he asked gently, nodding toward her damaged footwear. Clara nodded, unable to find her voice. She watched as this wealthy, important man examined her pitiful boot, with the same careful attention he might give a prize bull or a complex business contract. From his vest pocket, Elijah produced a spare bootlace, something he'd taken to carrying after his encounter with Jenny Walsh. With practiced movements, he threaded it through the eyelets, pulling the damaged boot as securely together as possible. "It won't last long," he said honestly, "but it should get you through the day." As he worked, Clara caught sight of his pocket watch when it swung free from his vest. The silver surface was engraved with initials, ESM. Below them, in smaller script, were the words, "For courage under fire." "There," Elijah said, helping her to her feet. "Better?" Clara tested the boot gingerly. While it was still clearly damaged, she could walk without the sole flopping embarrassingly. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. Elijah stood, brushing dust from his knees. For a moment he seemed about to say something more, but then Miss Hartwell emerged from the schoolhouse, and the spell was broken. "Mr. McGraw," the teacher exclaimed, clearly flustered to find the territory's wealthiest rancher in her schoolyard. "I didn't realize. Is there something I can help you with?" "Just lending a hand," Elijah replied, touching the brim of his hat politely. "Miss Henderson had some trouble with her shoe." He turned to go, then paused and looked back at Clara. "Your father was a good man," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight that she didn't yet understand. "He would be proud of how brave you were just now." With that, he walked away, leaving Clara staring after him with a dozen questions forming in her mind. How had he known her father? What did he mean about Samuel being proud? And why did his voice sound so sad when he mentioned her daddy? The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Clara found it difficult to concentrate on her lessons, her mind returning again and again to the morning's events. The other children avoided her, whether from shame over their earlier behavior or simple discomfort with the attention she'd received from such an important man. When Ruth came to collect her at the end of the day, Clara burst with questions before they'd even left the schoolyard. "Mama, Mr. McGraw said he knew Daddy. He said Daddy would be proud of me. How did he know Daddy? Why didn't you ever tell me they knew each other?" Ruth stopped walking, her face growing pale. "What do you mean, sweetheart? When did Mr. McGraw say this?" Clara explained the morning's events in detail, from the broken boot to Elijah's intervention to his strange comment about Samuel. Ruth listened with growing unease, her mind racing through possibilities and memories. "He fixed my shoe, Mama, just like you do. And he had this pretty watch with letters on it. ESM, I think it said." Ruth felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd never heard Samuel mention an Elijah McGraw, but the war years had been difficult to talk about. Samuel had shared some stories, but kept many memories locked away, too painful to revisit. Word of the incident spread through Millbrook with the characteristic speed of small-town gossip. By evening, half the town had heard some version of events. The wealthy rancher kneeling in the dirt to help a poor black child, the way he dismissed the other children with quiet authority, his gentle care with Clara's damaged boot. The reactions were predictably mixed. Some saw it as admirable charity, evidence of McGraw's good character. Others whispered about his motives, wondering why a man of his standing would concern himself with the Henderson family's troubles. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, Marcus Stone held court among the regular patrons, his voice carrying easily over. "The piano music, mark my words," Stone declared, his face flushed with whiskey and righteousness. "There's something unnatural about McGraw's interest in that woman and her child. Men like him don't kneel in the dirt for charity alone." Sheriff Hayes, nursing a single beer at the bar, turned to face the smaller man. "Maybe he just doesn't like seeing children picked on, Marcus. Some folks have basic human decency." Stone's eyes narrowed. "You defending him, Hayes? Interesting how quick you are to take the outsider's side against your own neighbors." "I'm not taking sides," Hayes replied evenly. "I'm just saying that helping a child with a broken shoe doesn't require any explanation beyond simple kindness." But even as he said it, Hayes found himself wondering about the coincidence of McGraw's sudden visible interest in the Henderson family. In 5 years, the rancher had maintained careful distance from everyone in town. Why was he suddenly making exceptions? Late that night, after Clara had fallen asleep, Ruth sat by their window looking out at the darkened street. In her hands, she held Samuel's medal, turning it over and over as she tried to make sense of the day's events. Elijah McGraw had known Samuel well enough to speak of him with obvious affection and respect. But how and why had he never approached her before if he'd been her husband's friend? The initials Clara had seen on the watch bothered her too. ESM. The middle initial suggested a name other than McGraw. Was Elijah not even his real first name? Ruth made a decision. Tomorrow she would seek out McGraw and demand answers. If he'd known Samuel, if there was some connection between them, she had a right to know. Her daughter deserved to understand her father's full story, and Ruth deserved to know why a wealthy rancher was suddenly taking such interest in their welfare. Outside, the night sounds of Millbrook settled into familiar patterns. But inside their small room above the general store, Ruth Henderson sat planning a conversation that would change everything she thought she knew about her late husband's past, and about the mysterious man who had shown such unexpected kindness to her daughter. Ruth Henderson had never visited the McGraw ranch, but desperation and curiosity had given her courage she didn't know she possessed. The morning after Clara's encounter with Elijah, she made arrangements with Mrs. Patterson to watch her daughter and set out on the 3-mile walk to the sprawling property that dominated the northern valley. The ranch was impressive even from a distance. White-painted buildings arranged with military precision, well-maintained fences stretching toward the horizon, cattle grazing in pastures that showed careful land management. This was wealth built on more than luck. It spoke of experience, planning, and substantial initial investment. Ruth paused at the main gate, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look in her worn traveling dress and practical boots. The circular drive led to a house that wouldn't have been out of place in San Francisco or Denver, complete with a wraparound porch and ornate gingerbread trim. Before she could lose her nerve, a voice called out from behind her, "Mrs. Henderson?" She turned to find Elijah McGraw approaching from the direction of the stables, leading a magnificent bay stallion. Even in his working clothes, leather chaps over dark trousers, a simple cotton shirt and worn boots, he carried himself with unmistakable authority. "Mr. McGraw," Ruth said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I hope you don't mind my coming unannounced. I wanted to thank you for your kindness to Clara yesterday." Elijah handed the stallion's reins to a stable boy who had materialized at his gesture. "There's no need for thanks. Any decent person would have done the same." "That's not true, and we both know it," Ruth replied. "Most folks would have walked on by." They stood in the morning sunlight, an awkward silence stretching between them. Ruth found herself studying his face, searching for something familiar. He was handsome in a weathered way, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors and burdens carried quietly. "Would you like some coffee?" Elijah asked finally. "My housekeeper makes it strong enough to wake the dead." Ruth nodded, following him toward the house. As they walked, she noticed his shirt was made from fabric she recognized, a particular shade of blue cotton that had been popular in San Francisco 3 years ago. She'd worked with identical material on several occasions, and something about seeing it here, in this context, nagged at her memory. The interior of the McGraw house was comfortable rather than ostentatious. Good furniture, obviously expensive but chosen for durability rather than display. It was the home of a man who valued quality but didn't need to prove his worth to visitors. "Mrs. Campbell," Elijah called to a middle-aged woman who emerged from what Ruth assumed was the kitchen. "Could you bring coffee to the parlor, please?" As they settled into chairs near a large window overlooking the ranch yard, Ruth pulled her sewing kit from her bag. She'd brought mending work as an excuse for the visit. "Mr. McGraw," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice her questions without seeming presumptuous. "You want to know how I knew your husband?" Elijah said quietly. "Yes." The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "Clara said you told her Samuel would be proud of her. That suggests you knew him well enough to understand his character." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently turning his coffee cup in its saucer. "Samuel Henderson was a good man, a brave man. The world is poorer for his loss." "That's not an answer," Ruth pressed. "When did you know him? Where? He never mentioned an Elijah McGraw to me." Before Elijah could respond, Mrs. Campbell returned with coffee and a plate of fresh biscuits. The interruption allowed Ruth to study him more carefully. There was pain in his expression, old grief mixed with something that might have been guilt. "The war," he said finally after Mrs. Campbell had retreated. "I knew Samuel during the war." Ruth felt her breath catch. "You fought with the 54th Massachusetts?" "Not with them, no, but our paths crossed several times. Your husband saved my life, Mrs. Henderson, more than once." As he spoke, Ruth found herself examining the threads in her sewing kit. Among the various colors was a spool of blue thread that perfectly matched Elijah's shirt. Thread she'd purchased specifically to repair a garment for a customer whose husband had served in an all-black regiment during the war. The coincidence seemed too particular to ignore. "Why didn't you contact me sooner?" she asked. "If Samuel meant enough to you that you'd help his daughter, why wait until now?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "Because I failed him. Because I made promises I couldn't keep. Because every time I've tried to help your family, I've wondered if I was doing it for the right reasons, or just to ease my own conscience." The honesty in his voice surprised her. She'd expected deflection or polite evasion, not this raw admission of guilt and uncertainty. What promises? That if anything happened to him, I'd make sure his family was provided for, that his sacrifices wouldn't be forgotten, that his daughter would have every opportunity to grow up proud of who her father was. Ruth set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "Samuel never mentioned you specifically, but he did tell me about the men he served with. He said they looked out for each other like brothers, regardless of rank or background. He said the war taught him that a man's character mattered more than the color of his skin or the size of his wallet." "He was right about that," Elijah said. "Samuel had more integrity than most of the officers I knew. He could have been a leader in any army, any time, any place." Back in town, Clara spent her day at Mrs. Patterson's house, but her mind kept wandering to the mysterious cowboy who had helped her. She'd been thinking about his watch, about the sadness in his eyes when he mentioned her father, about the way he'd spoken to her with the same respect most adults reserved for other adults. "Mrs. Patterson," she said suddenly, interrupting the older woman's knitting, "do you think rich people ever get lonely?" Mrs. Patterson looked up in surprise. "What an odd question, child. What makes you ask?" Mr. McGraw seemed lonely. Even when he was being kind, he seemed sad. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said thoughtfully, "I suppose having money doesn't guarantee having friends. Maybe especially in a place like this, where folks might wonder about a wealthy man's motives." Meanwhile, at the Silver Dollar Saloon, Marcus Stone was holding court again, this time with a larger and more receptive audience. "I'm telling you, something's not right about this whole situation," Stone declared, his voice carrying over the afternoon crowd. "First McGraw helps the Walsh girl, now he's focusing on the Henderson woman and her child. What's his real interest here?" "Maybe he's just decent," suggested Jim Morrison, the saloon keeper, but his voice lacked conviction. "Decent men don't single out specific families for charity," Stone replied. "Decent men support the church or the school fund. They don't go kneeling in the dirt for particular children while ignoring others." Several heads nodded around the room. Stone was voicing suspicions that had been growing since the previous day's incident. "And what do we really know about McGraw anyway?" Stone continued. "He showed up 5 years ago with enough money to buy the best ranch in the territory. Claims to be from Colorado, but he's never had visitors from there. Never talks about his past or his people. For all we know, he could be running from something." Back at the McGraw ranch, Ruth and Elijah continued their conversation, both dancing around. Deeper truths neither was quite ready to voice. But with each exchange, Ruth felt more certain that her instincts were correct. This man's connection to Samuel ran deeper than casual military acquaintance. As she prepared to leave, Ruth made an impulsive decision. From her sewing kit, she selected the spool of blue thread that matched his shirt. "Mr. McGraw," she said, offering him the thread, "I wonder if you might be needing this. It's a perfect match for your shirt, and I have more than I can use." Elijah took the thread, understanding immediately what she was really saying. His fingers closed around the spool, and for a moment their hands touched. Ruth felt a jolt of recognition, not romantic, but something deeper, as if she'd found a missing piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for years. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I believe I might need this, after all." As Ruth walked back toward town, she felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. She'd gotten answers to some of her questions, but those answers had only led to bigger mysteries. Who was Elijah McGraw, really? What exactly had happened between him and Samuel during the war? And why did she have the growing suspicion that her husband's death hadn't been the accident everyone believed it to be? Behind her, Elijah stood on his porch, holding the blue thread and watching her retreating figure. The conversation had gone better than he'd dared hope, but he knew it was only the beginning. Ruth Henderson was too intelligent to be satisfied with partial truths, and Clara deserved to know her father's full story. The question was whether he had the courage to tell it. Ruth Henderson had never visited the McGraw ranch, but desperation and curiosity had given her courage she didn't know she possessed. The morning after Clara's encounter with Elijah, she made arrangements with Mrs. Patterson to watch her daughter and set out on the 3-mile walk to the sprawling property that dominated the northern valley. The ranch was impressive, even from a distance. White-painted buildings arranged with military precision, well-maintained fences stretching toward the horizon, cattle grazing in pastures that showed careful land management. This was wealth built on more than luck. It spoke of experience, planning, and substantial initial investment. Ruth paused at the main gate, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look in her worn traveling dress and practical boots. The circular drive led to a house that wouldn't have been out of place in San Francisco or Denver, complete with a wraparound porch and ornate gingerbread trim. Before she could lose her nerve, a voice called out from behind her, "Mrs. Henderson." She turned to find Elijah McGraw approaching from the direction of the stables, leading a magnificent bay stallion. Even in his working clothes, leather chaps over dark trousers, a simple cotton shirt, and worn boots, he carried himself with unmistakable authority. "Mr. McGraw," Ruth said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, "I hope you don't mind my coming unannounced. I wanted to thank you for your kindness to Clara yesterday." Elijah handed the stallion's reins to a stable boy who had materialized at his gesture. "There's no need for thanks. Any decent person would have done the same." "That's not true, and we both know it," Ruth replied. "Most folks would have walked on by." They stood in the morning sunlight, an awkward silence stretching between them. Ruth found herself studying his face, searching for something familiar. He was handsome in a weathered way, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors and burdens carried quietly. "Would you like some coffee?" Elijah asked finally. "My housekeeper makes it strong enough to wake the dead." Ruth nodded, following him toward the house. As they walked, she noticed his shirt was made from fabric she recognized, a particular shade of blue cotton that had been popular in San Francisco 3 years ago. She'd worked with identical material on several occasions, and something about seeing it here, in this context, nagged at her memory. The interior of the McGraw house was comfortable rather than ostentatious. Good furniture, obviously expensive but chosen for durability rather than display. It was the home of a man who valued quality but didn't need to prove his worth to visitors. "Mrs. Campbell?" Elijah called to a middle-aged woman who emerged from what Ruth assumed was the kitchen. "Could you bring coffee to the parlor, please?" As they settled into chairs near a large window overlooking the ranch yard, Ruth pulled her sewing kit from her bag. She'd brought mending work as an excuse for the visit. "Mr. McGraw," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice her questions without seeming presumptuous. "You want to know how I knew your husband?" Elijah said quietly. "Yes." The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "Clara said you told her Samuel would be proud of her. That suggests you knew him well enough to understand his character." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently turning his coffee cup in its saucer. "Samuel Henderson was a good man, a brave man. The world is poorer for his loss." "That's not an answer," Ruth pressed. "When did you know him? Where? He never mentioned an Elijah McGraw to me." Before Elijah could respond, Mrs. Campbell returned, with coffee and a plate of fresh biscuits. The interruption allowed Ruth to study him more carefully. There was pain in his expression, old grief mixed with something that might have been guilt. "The war," he said finally after Mrs. Campbell had retreated. "I knew Samuel during the war." Ruth felt her breath catch. "You fought with the 54th Massachusetts?" "Not with them, no, but our paths crossed several times. Your husband saved my life, Mrs. Henderson, more than once." As he spoke, Ruth found herself examining the threads in her sewing kit. Among the various colors was a spool of blue thread that perfectly matched Elijah's shirt, thread she'd purchased specifically to repair a garment for a customer whose husband had served in an all-black regiment during the war. The coincidence seemed too particular to ignore. "Why didn't you contact me sooner?" she asked. "If Samuel meant enough to you that you'd help his daughter, why wait until now?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "Because I failed him, because I made promises I couldn't keep, because every time I've tried to help your family, I've wondered if I was doing it for the right reasons or just to ease my own conscience." The honesty in his voice surprised her. She'd expected deflection or polite evasion, not this raw admission of guilt and uncertainty. "What promises?" "That if anything happened to him, I'd make sure his family was provided for, that his sacrifices wouldn't be forgotten, that his daughter would have every opportunity to grow up proud of who her father was." Ruth set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "Samuel never mentioned you specifically, but he did tell me about the men he served with. He said they looked out for each other like brothers, regardless of rank or background. He said the war taught him that a man's character mattered more than the color of his skin or the size of his wallet." "He was right about that," Elijah said. "Samuel had more integrity than most of the officers I knew. He could have been a leader in any army, any time, any place." Back in town, Clara spent her day at Mrs. Patterson's house, but her mind kept wandering to the mysterious cowboy who had helped her. She'd been thinking about his watch, about the sadness in his eyes when he mentioned her father, about the way he'd spoken to her with the same respect most adults reserved for other adults. "Mrs. Patterson," she said suddenly, interrupting the older woman's knitting. "Do you think rich people ever get lonely?" Mrs. Patterson looked up in surprise. "What an odd question, child. What makes you ask?" Mr. McGraw seemed lonely. Even when he was being kind, he seemed sad. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said thoughtfully, "I suppose having money doesn't guarantee having friends. Maybe especially in a place like this, where folks might wonder about a wealthy man's motives." Meanwhile, at the Silver Dollar Saloon, Marcus Stone was holding court again, this time with a larger and more receptive audience. "I'm telling you, something's not right about this whole situation," Stone declared, his voice carrying over the afternoon crowd. "First, McGraw helps the Walsh girl. Now he's focusing on the Henderson woman and her child. What's his real interest here?" "Maybe he's just decent," suggested Jim Morrison, the saloon keeper, but his voice lacked conviction. "Decent men don't single out specific families for charity," Stone replied. "Decent men support the church or the school fund. They don't go kneeling in the dirt for particular children while ignoring others." Several heads nodded around the room. Stone was voicing suspicions that had been growing since the previous day's incident. "And what do we really know about McGraw anyway?" Stone continued. "He showed up 5 years ago with enough money to buy the best ranch in the territory. Claims to be from Colorado, but he's never had visitors from there. Never talks about his past or his people. For all we know, he could be running from something." Back at the McGraw ranch, Ruth and Elijah continued their conversation, both dancing around deeper truths neither was quite ready to voice. But with each exchange, Ruth felt more certain that her instincts were correct. This man's connection to Samuel ran deeper than casual military acquaintance. As she prepared to leave, Ruth made an impulsive decision. From her sewing kit, she selected the spool of blue thread that matched his shirt. "Mr. McGraw," she said, offering him the thread, "I wonder if you might be needing this. It's a perfect match for your shirt, and I have more than I can use." Elijah took the thread, understanding immediately what she was really saying. His fingers closed around the spool, and for a moment, their hands touched. Ruth felt a jolt of recognition, not romantic, but something deeper, as if she'd found a missing piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for years. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I believe I might need this after all." As Ruth walked back toward town, she felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. She'd gotten answers to some of her questions, but those answers had only led to bigger mysteries. Who was Elijah McGraw, really? What exactly had happened between him and Samuel during the war? And why did she have the growing suspicion that her husband's death hadn't been the accident everyone believed it to be? Behind her, Elijah stood on his porch, holding the blue thread and watching her retreating figure. The conversation had gone better than he dared hope, but he knew it was only the beginning. Ruth Henderson was too intelligent to be satisfied with partial truths, and Clara deserved to know her father's full story. The question was whether he had the courage to tell it. Ruth spent the next 2 days wrestling with her suspicions about Elijah's true identity. Clara's drawing had triggered memories she couldn't ignore, but she needed proof before confronting him with her theories. On Friday afternoon, while Clara was at school, Ruth climbed into their small attic space to retrieve the trunk containing Samuel's personal effects. She'd avoided going through these items since his death, finding the task too painful and unnecessary. But now, driven by a desperate need for answers, she carefully lifted out each precious remnant of her husband's life. His extra shirts, still carrying the faint scent of the soap he'd preferred, his shaving implements and the small mirror that had traveled with him from Massachusetts, his Bible, its pages marked with verses that had given him comfort during dark times. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oiled cloth, were Samuel's letters from the war. Ruth had read most of them years ago, but she'd never studied them with her current questions in mind. Now she spread them across the bed in chronological order, searching for any mention of the men who had served alongside her husband. The first few letters contained mostly routine updates, descriptions of camps and marches, complaints about food and weather, expressions of homesickness and love for her. But as the war progressed and Samuel's unit saw more action, his letters began including stories about his fellow soldiers. It was in a letter dated September 1863 that Ruth found what she was looking for. My dearest Ruth, I must tell you about an incident yesterday that has left me deeply grateful to divine providence and to a brave man whose friendship has become precious to me. We were under heavy fire near Charleston when a Confederate sniper found his range on our position. I was reloading when I heard the whistle of the bullet that should have ended my life. Instead, Sergeant E. Morgan of the Massachusetts Cavalry threw himself between me and certain death, taking a graze across his shoulder that was meant for my heart. When I tried to thank him afterward, Morgan would accept no praise. He said only that we are all brothers in this fight, and that a man's duty to his fellows transcends any consideration of race or rank. I have never met a more decent soul, Ruth. If anything should happen to me in this terrible conflict, I pray you might someday have the chance to know this man who has shown me such loyalty. Morgan speaks often of his plans after the war. He dreams of raising cattle in the Western Territories, of building something lasting and honest from the ground up. His family has means, and he could return east to comfort and position, but he believes his future lies in the frontier lands, where a man's character matters more than his pedigree. Ruth's hands shook as she read the words. E. Morgan, Elijah. Morgan, whose initials matched those on the pocket watch Clara had noticed. Samuel had written about this man with obvious affection and respect, crediting him with saving his life and speaking of their brotherhood that transcended racial boundaries. She found 2 more references to Morgan in later letters, including one that made her breath catch. Morgan has made me promise that if anything befalls him, I will write to his mother in Boston and tell her that her son died with honor. In return, I have asked him to swear that should I not survive this war, he will find you and Clara and ensure that my family knows how much you are loved. It may seem a morbid exchange, but in times like these, a man finds comfort in knowing his most precious obligations will be honored. Ruth sank back on her heels, the letter trembling in her hands. Elijah hadn't simply known Samuel. He'd made a sacred promise to look after Samuel's family in the event of his death. His presence in Millbrook, his careful attention to their welfare, his reluctance to explain his motives, it all made terrible, beautiful sense. But why the deception? Why use the name McGraw instead of Morgan? And why wait 3 years after Samuel's death to fulfill his promise? A knock at the door interrupted her churning thoughts. Ruth quickly gathered the letters and climbed down from the attic, smoothing her skirts and trying to compose herself before answering. Sheriff Hayes stood on her threshold, his expression grave. Ruth, I need to speak with you about the situation developing in town. May I come in? She led him to the small sitting area, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his hand rested unconsciously near his gun. I'll speak plainly, Hayes began. Marcus Stone is stirring up trouble about you and McGraw. He's got a group of men convinced that McGraw's interest in your family is somehow improper or suspicious. Ruth felt anger flare in her chest. And what exactly are they suspicious of, Sheriff? They're suggesting that a wealthy white man wouldn't help a struggling black family without expecting something in return. Stone's been questioning McGraw's motives and your character. The injustice of it hit Ruth like a physical blow. Here was Elijah Morgan, honoring a sacred promise made to a dying comrade, being vilified by small minds that couldn't conceive of selfless loyalty. And she was being painted as either a victim or a willing participant in some imagined scandal. Sheriff Hayes, Ruth said, fighting to keep her voice steady. What do you know about Mr. McGraw's past? Hayes looked surprised by the question. Not much, I'll admit. He came here about 5 years ago with enough money to buy the best ranch in the territory. Claims to be from Colorado originally, but he's never talked much about his background. Ruth made a decision that would change everything. "Sheriff, I have reason to believe Mr. McGraw knew my husband during the war. I think his kindness to Clara and me is connected to promises he made to Samuel." She showed Hayes the relevant letters, watching his expression change as he read Samuel's accounts of Morgan's courage and character. "Well, I'll be damned," Hayes muttered, then caught himself. "Pardon the language, Ruth, but this changes things considerably. If McGraw, or Morgan, is honoring a promise to a fallen comrade, that's about as honorable as a man can get. The question is why he's kept it secret," Ruth said. "Why use a false name? Why not simply approach me directly and explain the connection?" "Maybe he was afraid," Hayes suggested. "Maybe he thought you wouldn't believe him, or that the truth would be too painful. Or maybe," Ruth said quietly, "he was afraid of exactly what's happening now, that people would twist his good intentions into something ugly." Meanwhile, across town, Clara was having her own encounter with the growing tensions. Walking home from school, she'd been approached by Tommy Mitchell and his usual group of followers. "My pa says your mama's got herself a rich boyfriend," Tommy taunted. "Says she's using you to get his money." Clara felt the familiar burn of anger and shame, but this time she also felt something new, a fierce protectiveness of the man who had shown her kindness when others had offered only cruelty. "Mr. McGraw is a good man," she said, standing as tall as her 8-year-old frame would allow. "He helped me when I needed help, just like he helped Jenny Walsh. That's what good people do." "Good people don't pick favorites," Billy Harper chimed. "They help everyone equally, not just certain families." "Maybe he helps the people who need it most," Clara shot back, surprising herself with her boldness. "Maybe he helps people who remind him of someone he cared about." The words came from some deep instinct she didn't fully understand, but they silenced the boys momentarily. Clara took advantage of their confusion to walk away with as much dignity as she could muster. That evening, as Ruth helped Clara with her lessons, her daughter recounted the afternoon's confrontation. "Mama," Clara said quietly, "why do people always think the worst about kindness? Why can't they just accept that someone might want to help without expecting anything back?" Ruth looked at her daughter's serious face and realized that Clara, in her childish wisdom, had identified the core of their dilemma. In a world where cynicism often masqueraded as sophistication, simple human decency had become suspect. Some people find it easier to believe in selfishness than in genuine goodness, Ruth explained. They assume everyone has hidden motives because that's how they think themselves. But Mr. McGraw really is good, isn't he, Mama? I can see it in his eyes. Ruth thought about Samuel's letters, about the promises made between brothers in arms, about a man who had spent years carrying the burden of a sacred obligation. "Yes, sweetheart," she said firmly. "I believe Mr. McGraw is very good indeed." Outside, the sounds of evening settled over Millbrook, but Ruth Henderson knew that darker forces were gathering. Marcus Stone's campaign of whispers and innuendo was gaining momentum, and soon the entire community would be forced to choose sides. The truth about Elijah Morgan's identity and mission would have to come out soon before malicious gossip destroyed the reputation of a man who had done nothing but honor his word to a fallen friend. Ruth only hoped that when the revelation came, it would be enough to shame the town's gossips into silence and allow Elijah to fulfill his promise to Samuel in peace. The next morning, Ruth made her decision. Armed with Samuel's letters and her newfound understanding of Elijah's true identity, she set out once again for the McGraw ranch. This time, however, she was not seeking answers. She was bringing them. Elijah was working with a young horse in the corral when she arrived, his movements patient and sure as he helped the animal adjust to a halter. The sight reminded Ruth powerfully of Samuel, who had possessed the same gentle way with creatures that needed guidance rather than force. "Mr. Morgan," she called out as she approached the fence. Elijah went perfectly still. The horse, sensing the sudden tension, tossed its head. Nervously, after a long moment, Elijah handed the lead rope to a ranch hand and walked slowly toward the fence. "So you know," he said quietly. I know enough, Ruth replied, pulling Samuel's letter from her bag. I know that you saved my husband's life. I know that he trusted you enough to make you promise to look after his family. I know that you've been carrying that burden for 3 years, wondering if you were doing right by his memory. Elijah's jaw worked silently as she spoke. When she held out the letter, he took it with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. If anything should happen to me in this terrible conflict, he read aloud, I pray you might someday have the chance to know this man who has shown me such loyalty. He looked up at Ruth. Samuel wrote that about me, among other things, Ruth said. He also wrote about the promise you made each other to look after the other's family if the worst happened. 20 years fell away as Elijah's mind returned to that Charleston hospital tent where 2 wounded soldiers had faced their mortality with the stark honesty that only comes in war's darkest moments. September 1863, Charleston, South Carolina, Elijah. Samuel Morgan lay on a narrow cot, his shoulder burning from the Confederate bullet that had been meant for Samuel Henderson. Beside him, Samuel sat with his own bandaged arm, the result of shrapnel from the same artillery barrage. You shouldn't have done that, Samuel said for the 10th time. That bullet had my name on it. Bullets don't have names, Elijah replied, wincing as the army surgeon's crude stitches pulled tight. Besides, I was closer, simple mathematics. Samuel shook his head. Nothing simple about it. You risked your life for mine, and we both know there are plenty of white soldiers who wouldn't have bothered. Then they're not soldiers worth serving with, Elijah said firmly. War strips away everything that doesn't matter, Samuel. What's left is what a man truly is, and you're the finest man I've served alongside. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the distant sound of artillery and the closer sounds of wounded men trying to find comfort on hard cots. Finally, Samuel spoke again. Elijah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Ask away. If I don't make it home, if something happens to me in this war, would you find my wife and daughter? Would you make sure they know how much I loved them? Elijah studied his friend's face. You're going to make it home, Samuel. This war can't last much longer. Maybe, but if I don't, promise me. Ruth is strong, but she'll be alone in a world that's not kind to women on their own. Clara will grow up not knowing her father. Promise me you'll find them and tell them my stories. I promise, Elijah said solemnly, but only if you'll make the same promise to me. If something happens, find my mother in Boston. Tell her I died trying to build something better than what we inherited. They shook hands then, 2 men from different worlds bound by shared danger and mutual respect. Neither could have imagined that Samuel's promise would never be tested, while Elijah's would haunt him for years. Back in the present, Elijah handed the letter back to Ruth with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated guilt and grief. I failed him, he said simply. I promised to look after you and Clara, and I waited 3 years to even find you. By the time I tracked you to Millbrook, I was so ashamed of my delay that I didn't know how to approach you directly. Why did you wait? Ruth asked, though her voice held understanding rather than accusation. Because I was a coward, Elijah replied bitterly. Because I spent years trying to convince myself that Samuel had survived the war and that my promise was unnecessary. Because when I finally accepted that he was gone, I was afraid you'd blame me for not saving him too. Ruth studied his face, seeing the weight of responsibility he'd been carrying. Elijah, how did Samuel die? The official report said it was an accident at the mine, but you looked like a man bearing more guilt than circumstances warrant. Elijah's shoulders sagged. Because it was my mine, Ruth, the Copper Creek operation. I owned it. Samuel died working for me, and I wasn't even there to help him. The revelation hit Ruth like a physical blow. You're mine? I came to Arizona Territory in 1876, using my family money to buy land and start the mining operation. When I heard Samuel had moved to Millbrook, I was overjoyed. Here was my chance to finally help him, to give him the security and opportunity he deserved. But you never told him who you were. I tried to, several times, but Samuel was proud, Ruth. He didn't want charity, even from a friend. So I hired him as a worker, paid him well, and planned to eventually bring him in as a partner once he'd accept it without feeling like he was accepting a handout. Ruth felt tears threatening as the full tragedy of their situation became clear. He died before you could tell him. The cave-in happened on a day I was supposed to be there for safety inspections. I'd been called away to Phoenix on territorial business. If I'd been there, if I'd insisted on better safety protocols instead of trusting my foreman's assurances, Samuel might still be alive. From behind them came a small gasp. Ruth turned to see Clara standing 10 feet away, her school satchel dropped forgotten in the dust. The child's face was pale with confusion and dawning understanding. "Clara," Ruth said gently, "what are you doing here, sweetheart?" "Miss Hartwell sent me home early because I wasn't feeling well," Clara said, her voice small and uncertain. "I saw you talking, and I wanted to say hello, but then, Mr. McGraw, you knew my daddy." Elijah knelt down to Clara's level, his expression infinitely gentle. "I knew him very well, Clara. Your father was my friend, and he was one of the bravest, kindest men I ever met. But why didn't you tell me before? Why did you pretend you didn't know him?" Before Elijah could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. A group of riders was approaching the ranch at a fast clip, led by Marcus Stone. Even from a distance, Ruth could see the determined set of the men's faces. "Trouble," Elijah said grimly, rising to his feet. The riders reined in their horses in a cloud of dust, Stone's face flushed with righteous anger. "McGraw," Stone called out, "we need to talk." "About what?" Elijah asked evenly. "About your inappropriate interest in the Henderson family? About why a wealthy white man is spending so much time with a colored woman and her child? The decent folks of Millbrook want answers." Ruth felt Clara move closer to her, instinctively seeking protection from the hostile voices. She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and stepped forward. "Mr. Stone," she said firmly, "Mr. McGraw's business with my family is exactly that, our business. I fail to see how it concerns you or anyone else. It concerns the whole community. When outsiders start stirring up trouble," Stone replied, "when they start giving certain people ideas above their station." "What kind of ideas?" Ruth demanded, her anger flaring. "Ideas about equality, about mixing, about forgetting the natural order of things." Elijah's voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to command. "Mr. Stone, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." "I'm calling a town meeting," Stone announced. "Tonight, 7 o'clock at the church. Let the whole community hear what you have to say about your interest in the Henderson family. Let them judge for themselves whether your motives are as pure as you claim." With that, Stone wheeled his horse around and led his group back toward town, leaving Ruth, Elijah, and Clara standing in the settling dust. "What are we going to do?" Ruth asked quietly. Elijah looked at Clara, who was still pressed against her mother's side, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "We're going to tell them the truth," he said simply. "All of it. Samuel deserves that much, and so do you." But as he spoke, Elijah wondered if the truth would be enough to overcome the prejudice and suspicion that had been festering in Millbrook's shadows. Tonight would determine whether Samuel Henderson's memory would be honored, or whether the promises made between two soldiers would be twisted into something ugly by small minds and smaller hearts. The Millbrook Community Church had never held as many people as it did that October evening. Every pew was packed, with more residents standing along the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. Word of Marcus Stone's challenge to Elijah, McGraw, had spread throughout the territory, drawing curious onlookers from neighboring towns who wanted to witness what promised to be a dramatic confrontation. Ruth sat in the third row with Clara pressed close against her side, feeling the weight of dozens of stares. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few displayed the kind of predatory interest that fed on conflict and scandal. Sheriff Hayes sat directly behind them, his presence both protective and ominous. Elijah entered precisely at 7 o'clock, walking alone down the center aisle with his head held high. He wore his best suit, dark wool that emphasized his military bearing, and carried a leather satchel that Ruth hadn't seen before. As he passed, conversations died to whispers, then to complete silence. Marcus Stone stood at the front of the church beside Reverend Collins, who looked deeply uncomfortable with his sanctuary being used for what promised to be an ugly confrontation. Stone's face was flushed with excitement and righteous indignation. "Folks," Stone began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the packed building, "we're here tonight because our community faces a crisis. For weeks now, we've watched Elijah McGraw pay suspicious attention to Ruth Henderson and her child. We've seen him single them out for charity while ignoring other families in need." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ruth felt Clara's small hand slip into hers. "Now, some might say this is simple Christian charity," Stone continued, "but I ask you, why this particular family? What makes them so special that our wealthiest citizen kneels in the dirt to tie a child's shoes? What debt could he possibly owe to a poor widow and her daughter? Maybe the debt of human decency," called out Doc Williams from the back of the church, earning a few scattered chuckles and several sharp looks. "Dr. Williams raises an interesting point," Stone replied smoothly. "But decent men support worthy causes openly, through proper channels. They don't engage in secretive favoritism that raises questions about their motives." Elijah had remained silent through Stone's opening remarks, but now he rose from his seat in the front pew. "Mr. Stone," he said, his voice calm but carrying, "easily through the building, you've made a number of accusations tonight. Before this goes any further, perhaps you should state clearly what you're suggesting." Stone's eyes gleamed with triumph. "I'm suggesting that no white man of your standing helps a colored family without expecting something in return. I'm suggesting that your charity comes with strings attached, and I'm suggesting that the people of Millbrook deserve to know what those strings are." A collective intake of breath swept through the church. Ruth felt her face burn with humiliation and rage. Beside her, Clara whispered, "Mama, what does he mean?" Before Ruth could answer, Elijah spoke again, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Mr. Stone, you're suggesting that my assistance to the Henderson family is motivated by immoral intentions. Is that correct?" "I'm saying that your behavior raises questions that demand answers," Stone replied, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Then let me provide those answers," Elijah said, opening his leather satchel. "But first, let me correct an error in your assumptions. My name is not Elijah McGraw. It's Elijah Samuel Morgan, formerly Sergeant Morgan of the 2nd Massachusetts. Cavalry!" Shocked murmurs filled the church. Ruth heard Clara gasp beside her. "I came to Millbrook 5 years ago, using an assumed name because I was running from my past, not from the law, but from my failures. I came here specifically to find the family of Samuel Henderson, a man who saved my life during the war and to whom I owed a debt of honor." Elijah reached into his satchel and withdrew a folded document. "This is Samuel Henderson's death certificate, signed by the territorial coroner. I've never shown it to his widow because the truth it contains has been too painful for me to face." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. "Elijah, don't—" "Ruth, they deserve to know," he said gently, then addressed the crowd again. "Samuel Henderson didn't die in an accident. He died a hero, saving the lives of 5 men who were trapped when a support beam collapsed in the Copper Creek mine." The church fell silent, except for the sound of Clara's sharp intake of breath. "I owned that mine," Elijah continued, his voice heavy with guilt. "Samuel worked for me, though he didn't know who I really was. On October 15th, 1882, I was supposed to conduct safety inspections, but was called away to Phoenix on territorial business. In my absence, my foreman ignored protocols and ordered the men to continue working in conditions I would have deemed unsafe. He unfolded the death certificate and began to read. Samuel Henderson died of injuries sustained while attempting to rescue fellow miners from a cave-in at the Copper Creek mining operation. Witnesses report that Henderson remained in the collapsing tunnel until all 5 trapped men had been evacuated to safety. His actions prevented what would have been a catastrophic loss of life. Ruth's vision blurred with tears as she heard the full truth of Samuel's death for the first time. Beside her, Clara was crying openly, but whether from grief or pride, Ruth couldn't tell. 3 of the men Samuel saved that day work on my ranch now, Elijah continued. They're alive because a man I'd failed to protect properly chose to risk everything for people he barely knew. That's the kind of man Samuel Henderson was, the same man who threw himself between me and a Confederate bullet 20 years ago. Marcus Stone's face had gone pale, but he wasn't ready to concede defeat. Even if that's true, it doesn't explain why you hid your identity. Why not approach Mrs. Henderson directly? Because I was ashamed, Elijah replied simply. Because I'd promised Samuel during the war that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure his family was provided for. Because I'd failed to keep that promise for 3 years while I wallowed in guilt and self-pity. He turned to face Ruth and Clara directly. Because I was afraid that when Ruth Henderson learned the truth, that her husband had died working in my mine while I was hundreds of miles away, she'd realize that I was responsible for his death. No, Ruth said, rising to her feet with tears streaming down her face. No, you're not responsible. You're the reason Samuel had work at all. You're the reason we had money for food and shelter those last months of his life. She turned to address the crowded church, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Samuel wrote to me about the friends he'd made in the war. He wrote about men who showed him kindness when others showed only cruelty. He wrote about Elijah Morgan with the kind of respect and affection reserved for true brothers. From his satchel, Elijah produced a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This is my war diary," he said. "In it are entries about Samuel Henderson, about his courage, his integrity, his dreams for the future. One entry, dated September 20th, 1863, describes the promise we made to each other to look after the other's family if the worst happened." He opened the journal and read, "Samuel Henderson is the finest man I've served with in this war. Today we spoke of our families, our hopes for after the fighting ends. If I don't survive this conflict, I pray someone will tell my mother that her son tried to build something worthy of her sacrifice. In return, I've promised Samuel that if he falls, I'll find his wife and daughter and make sure they know how deeply he loved them. More than that, I'll make sure they have every opportunity to build the life Samuel dreamed of providing for them." Clara stood up on her pew, her young voice cutting through the adult conversations. "My daddy was a hero?" "Yes, sweetheart," Elijah said, kneeling down to her level. "Your father was the bravest man I've ever known. He saved my life in the war, and he died saving other people's lives. That's who Samuel Henderson was, a man who put others before himself always. And you're trying to keep the promise you made to him?" "I'm trying, Clara. I know I should have found you sooner, but I'm trying now." From the back of the church, a weathered voice spoke up. "Morgan's telling the truth about the mine accident." All heads turned to see Pete Kowalski, one of the miners Samuel had saved, standing near the door. With him were 2 other men Ruth recognized as McGraw ranch hands. "Samuel Henderson pulled me out of that tunnel when the roof started coming down," Kowalski continued. "Could have run for safety himself, but he stayed until we were all clear. Bravest thing I ever saw. He saved my life too," added Jim Garrett, another survivor. "Wouldn't leave until he knew we were all safe. Died because he cared more about us than himself." The church buzzed with conversation as the full impact of these revelations sank in. Ruth saw faces that had been suspicious or hostile beginning to show shame and understanding. But Marcus Stone wasn't finished. Red-faced and desperate, he made one final attempt to salvage his position. "Even if all this is true," he shouted over the crowd noise, "it doesn't change the fundamental issue. Morgan has been deceiving this community for 5 years. He's used false names, hidden his past, manipulated situations to his advantage. How can we trust anything he says?" "Because," said a new voice from the doorway, "sometimes a man's actions speak louder than his words." Sheriff Hayes had been standing quietly near the back, but now he moved forward, holding a telegram in his hand. "Folks, I took the liberty of wiring the territorial marshal about Mr. Morgan's background. This is his response." Hayes unfolded the telegram and read, "Elijah Samuel Morgan, served with distinction in 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry. Medal of Honor recipient for actions at Fort Wagner. Family prominent in Boston society. No criminal record. Character references impeccable." Why do you ask? The church fell silent again as the implications sank in. Marcus Stone's face had gone from red to ashen gray. "Mr. Stone," Sheriff Hayes continued, "seems to me you've spent considerable effort slandering a decorated war hero who's been trying to honor a promise made to a fallen comrade. Might want to consider whether that's the legacy you want to leave. In this community," Clara tugged on Elijah's sleeve. When he bent down, she whispered something in his ear that made his eyes fill with tears. He nodded and straightened up. "Clara Henderson has just reminded me of something important," he told the crowd. "She asked me what her father would think of all this arguing. The answer is that Samuel Henderson would want his community to judge. People by their character, not their color or their bank account. He'd want children to be protected from cruelty, regardless of who their parents are. And he'd want the men he died saving to know that their lives mattered." Elijah looked directly at Marcus Stone. "Sam would also want forgiveness for those who spoke without thinking, because he believed people could change when they understood the truth." The meeting ended quietly after that, with people filing out in small groups, their conversations subdued and thoughtful. Ruth noticed that several neighbors who had avoided her recently now nodded respectfully or murmured words of sympathy about Samuel's heroic death. As the church emptied, Clara walked up to Marcus Stone, who was gathering his things with obvious embarrassment. "Mr. Stone," she said in her clear child's voice, "I forgive you for saying mean things about Mama and me. My daddy would want me to." Marcus Stone looked down at the 8-year-old girl he'd tried to use as a weapon against her protector, and for the first time in years, he felt genuinely ashamed of himself. The truth, Ruth realized, had indeed set them free, but it had also transformed their quiet struggle into something much larger. Now the whole territory knew Samuel Henderson's story, and his daughter would grow up knowing that her father had died as he had lived, putting others before himself, fighting for what was right, and inspiring those around him to be better than they thought they could be. The morning after the church meeting brought a stream of visitors to Ruth's door. Some came to offer belated condolences about Samuel's heroic death, others to apologize for believing Marcus Stone's insinuations, and a few to satisfy their curiosity about the dramatic revelations that were now the talk of the entire territory. Mrs. Morrison arrived first, bringing fresh bread and obvious embarrassment. "Ruth, I owe you an apology," she said, settling at the kitchen table while Clara practiced her letters nearby. "I should have spoken up sooner when the gossip started. Tom always said Mr. McGraw, Mr. Morgan, was the finest man he'd ever worked for, and I should have trusted that judgment." "There's no need to apologize," Ruth replied, though she appreciated the woman's honesty. "People were confused by the secrecy, and Marcus Stone took advantage of that confusion. Still doesn't make it right," Mrs. Morrison insisted. "Your Samuel was a hero, and you deserved better from this community." After Mrs. Morrison left, Doc Williams appeared with his medical bag and a thoughtful expression. "Ruth, I've been thinking about what we learned last night, and something's been bothering me. Mind if I ask you a few questions about Samuel's time in Millbrook?" "Of course, Doc. What's troubling you?" Doc Williams settled into a chair with a slight grimace. His arthritis was acting up again. When Samuel first arrived here in 1875, he filed claims on some of the best grazing land in the valley. Prime property near Willow Creek, good water access, sheltered from the worst winds. But somehow he ended up with that little hardscrabble plot near the old silver mine instead. Ruth nodded. Samuel said there were complications with his original claim, something about prior ownership that hadn't been properly recorded. That's what I thought I remembered, Doc said, his expression grave. But last night got me thinking about who ended up with Samuel's original claim. You know whose cattle graze those creek-bottom pastures now? A cold feeling settled in Ruth's stomach. Marcus Stone. Marcus Stone, Doc confirmed. Now I'm not one for conspiracy theories, but it strikes me as mighty convenient that Stone ended up with the exact property Samuel originally claimed, especially given what we saw of his character last night. Clara looked up from her slate. What does that mean, Mama? It means, said a new voice from the doorway, that there may be more to your father's story than any of us realized. Elijah Morgan stood on the threshold, holding what appeared to be an official document. Ruth invited him in, noting the determined set of his jaw and the fire in his eyes. I've been up all night going through Samuel's papers and comparing them to territorial land records, Elijah said without preamble. Ruth, I think your husband may have been cheated out of more than just his grazing land. He spread several documents. On the table, original land claims, territorial surveys, and what appeared to be a legal deed written in Spanish. This is a copy of Millbrook's original town charter from 1874, Elijah explained. According to this document, there were 7 founding members who pooled their resources to establish the community. Their names are all listed here as permanent stakeholders in the town's development. Ruth scanned the document, her eyes widening, as she found a familiar name written in faded brown ink: Samuel Henderson, late of Massachusetts, veteran of the Union Army. Samuel helped found this town, she whispered. More than that, Elijah said grimly. According to these records, Samuel contributed both money and labor to establish Millbrook's original survey, its first wells, and the layout of Main Street. He was supposed to receive permanent water rights and a share of any mineral discoveries within the town boundaries. Doc Williams leaned forward to examine the papers. If this is legitimate, then Samuel's family should have inherited significant assets when he died. Water rights alone would be worth a fortune in this territory. But we never received anything like that, Ruth said, confusion mixing with growing anger. After Samuel died, Marcus Stone approached me about settling some debts Samuel supposedly owed. He said Samuel's estate barely covered his obligations. Elijah's expression darkened. Stone handled Samuel's estate. He said he was helping as a neighbor. There were so many papers to sign, and I was so overwhelmed by grief that I trusted his explanations. Ruth, Elijah said gently, I need you to think carefully. What exactly did you sign? Ruth closed her eyes, trying to remember those awful weeks after Samuel's death. There were several documents. Stone said one was to release Samuel's mining company benefits. Another was supposed to clear up the land claim complications. And there was something about transferring water rights to avoid legal disputes. You signed over Samuel's founding member status, Doc Williams said, his voice filled with indignation. Stone convinced you to sign away your family's inheritance. Clara had been listening with growing confusion. Mama, does this mean we're supposed to be rich? Before Ruth could answer, Sheriff Hayes appeared in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, folks, but there's been a development you need to know about. Hayes entered and closed the door behind him. Marcus Stone left town this morning. Loaded wagon. Heading south toward the border. Seems he was in quite a hurry. Running, Elijah said flatly. He knows we're going to discover the full extent of what he did. Already have, partially, Hayes replied, producing his own set of documents. I searched Stone's office this morning under territorial authority. found records going back 8 years showing a pattern of fraudulent land deals and forged documents. Hayes spread the papers on the table alongside Elijah's findings. Stone's been systematically cheating widows and struggling families out of their property rights. Samuel Henderson wasn't his only victim, just his most profitable one. Ruth felt the room spinning as the full scope of Stone's deception became clear. How many families? At least 6 that I can document so far, Hayes said. Mexican families whose land grants weren't recognized by territorial courts. Widows who didn't understand the legal system. Veterans like Samuel who trusted Stone's claims of neighborly assistance. And Samuel's founding member rights. According to the original charter, those rights should have passed to his widow and daughter automatically. Stone convinced you to sign them over by claiming they were worthless complications, but he immediately registered them in his own name. Clara had been quietly absorbing the conversation, but now she stood up with unusual solemnity. Sheriff, Hayes, does this mean Mr. Stone stole from us? Yes, Clara, it means exactly that. Then we need to get our property back, she said with the simple certainty of childhood. Daddy earned it, so it belongs to us. Ruth looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Clara was displaying the same sense of justice that had driven Samuel to fight in the war and die saving strangers in a collapsing mine. It's not that simple, sweetheart, Ruth began, but Elijah interrupted her. Actually, it might be exactly that simple. Hayes, what's the territorial law regarding fraudulent property transfers? If we can prove fraud, and these documents certainly suggest it, then the transfers are void. Property reverts to the rightful owners, and the perpetrator faces criminal charges. But Stone's fled the territory, Ruth pointed out. How can we recover property from a man who's running from the law? We don't need Stone to reclaim what's rightfully yours, Elijah said. We need the territorial court to recognize the fraud and invalidate the transfers. Stone's guilt or innocence is a separate matter from your property rights. Doc Williams had been studying the town charter with growing amazement. Ruth, do you understand what this means? According to this document, Samuel Henderson wasn't just a founding member of Millbrook. He was arguably the most important founding member. His contributions made the town possible. How so? Look at this provision here, Doc said, pointing to a specific clause. Samuel provided the initial survey work that established property boundaries for the entire settlement. Without that survey, none of the later land sales or developments would have been legally valid. Elijah nodded grimly. Which means that not only did Stone steal from your family, Ruth, he's been profiting from land sales that were only possible because of Samuel's work that Samuel was never properly compensated for. But why didn't anyone remember this? Ruth asked. How could Samuel's role in founding the town be forgotten? An uncomfortable silence settled over the room as the adults contemplated the answer no one wanted to voice aloud. Finally, Clara spoke with the blunt honesty of childhood. Because Daddy was colored, and some people don't like remembering that. Colored folks helped build things. Ruth felt tears sting her eyes at her daughter's matter-of-fact assessment of adult prejudice. Clara, it's true, isn't it, Mama? People like Mr. Stone don't want to admit that a colored man helped start their town, so they just forgot about Daddy's contributions and pretended he was just another poor worker. Elijah knelt down to Clara's level. Your father's contributions weren't forgotten by everyone, Clara. They were deliberately erased by people who couldn't accept that a black man had been essential to their community's success. But we can fix that, can't we? Clara asked. We can make people remember the truth about Daddy? Yes, Elijah said firmly. We can, and we will. Sheriff Hayes gathered up the documents. I'll need to file these with the territorial court and request an emergency hearing. Given the evidence in Stone's flight, I don't think there'll be much question about the fraud. How long will it take? Ruth asked. Could be weeks, could be months. Legal proceedings move slowly, even with clear evidence. But in the meantime, Elijah said, There's nothing stopping us from making sure the community knows the truth about Samuel Henderson's role in founding Millbrook. Clara tugged on Elijah's sleeve. Can we put up a sign or something, so everyone knows Daddy was important? We can do better than that, Elijah replied, an idea clearly forming in his mind. We can make sure your father's name is permanently remembered in this town he helped create. As the group continued planning their response to Stone's deception, Ruth felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger at having been cheated, grief for the security her family should have had, and pride at learning the full extent of Samuel's contributions to their community. But above all, she felt determination. Samuel Henderson had died saving others, and now his memory deserved to be saved from those who would diminish or erase it. Her daughter would grow up knowing not just that her father was a hero, but that he was a founding father of the very town that had tried to forget him. The truth about Samuel's legacy would not be buried again. Not while Ruth Henderson drew breath and Clara carried his name forward into the future. 2 weeks after Sheriff Hayes filed the fraud charges against Marcus Stone, the territorial judge arrived in Millbrook for an emergency hearing. Judge Benjamin Crawford was a fair man, known for his intolerance of legal shenanigans and his respect for documentary evidence. Exactly the kind of official Ruth's case needed. The hearing was held in the church again, since it was the only building large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered. Word of the Henderson family's legal battle had spread throughout the territory, drawing spectators, journalists, and even some of Marcus Stone's other victims who hoped to see justice. Finally served, Ruth sat at the front with Clara beside her, both dressed in their Sunday best. Elijah had insisted on paying for new clothes for the occasion, arguing that Samuel's family should be properly attired when reclaiming their rightful inheritance. Clara wore a beautiful blue dress that matched her father's favorite color, her hair neatly braided and adorned with a ribbon that had belonged to her grandmother. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Crawford," Sheriff Hayes called out, and the packed church rose as one. Judge Crawford was a tall, severe-looking man with gray whiskers and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He settled behind a makeshift bench constructed from the church's lectern and surveyed the crowd with obvious skepticism about the entire proceeding. "Be seated," he commanded, then shuffled through the documents Hayes had provided. "This is highly irregular conducting territorial business in a church, but I understand the circumstances are equally irregular." Hayes stood to present the case. "Your Honor, we're here because Marcus Stone systematically defrauded multiple families of their legitimate property rights, with the Henderson family suffering the most significant losses. And where is Mr. Stone to answer these charges?" "Fled the territory, Your Honor. Left town the morning after his fraudulent activities were exposed." Judge Crawford made a note in his record book. "Convenient timing. Very well, Sheriff Hayes. Present your evidence." What followed was a methodical presentation of documents that painted Marcus Stone as a calculating criminal who had preyed on vulnerable families for years. The original town charter clearly showed Samuel Henderson as a founding member with permanent rights to water access and mineral claims. The papers Ruth had been tricked into signing were obviously fraudulent, with several signatures that handwriting experts had already identified as forgeries. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. As Hayes was presenting Samuel's land claims, Ruth remembered something from her husband's personal effects. "Your Honor," she said, standing suddenly, "may I present additional evidence?" Judge Crawford looked annoyed at the interruption, but nodded. His consent. Ruth opened Samuel's Bible to a page she'd examined hundreds of times without understanding its significance. Pressed between the pages was a folded document, Samuel's family tree, written in his careful handwriting and dating back to his grandfather's generation. "This is my husband's record of our family history," Ruth explained, her voice carrying clearly through the silent church. Samuel was meticulous about documentation, and he recorded not just births and deaths, but also property acquisitions and legal rights. She handed the document to Judge Crawford, who examined it with growing interest. According to this family record, the judge said, reading aloud, Samuel Henderson inherited water rights from his grandfather's homestead claim, which he brought with him to Arizona Territory and legally transferred to his Millbrook properties. Those are the same water rights Marcus Stone convinced me to sign over, Ruth said. He told me they were worthless complications, but according to territorial law, inherited water rights from federal homestead claims take precedence over local disputes. Judge Crawford's expression grew thunderous. Mrs. Henderson, these water rights would be worth thousands of dollars in this territory. If Mr. Stone convinced you to transfer them under false pretenses, he's committed a felony. The judge turned to address the packed church. Is there anyone present who can testify to the value of these water rights or Mr. Stone's handling of the Henderson estate? Several hands went up, including those of Tom Morrison and Pete Peterson. One by one, community members testified that Stone had systematically deceived Ruth about the value of Samuel's assets, while simultaneously acquiring those assets for his own benefit. Doc Williams provided the most damaging testimony. Your Honor, I was present when Marcus Stone told Mrs. Henderson that her husband's water rights were legally disputed and worthless. I now know this was completely false. Those rights were clearly established and extremely valuable. And what did you observe about Mrs. Henderson's state of mind during these transactions? She was devastated by grief, Your Honor, barely able to understand the simplest conversations, let alone complex legal documents. Stone took advantage of a widow's vulnerability. Judge Crawford spent several minutes reviewing all the evidence, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting specific documents be re-examined. Finally, he set down his papers and addressed the crowd. In 40 years of territorial law, I have rarely seen such a clear-cut case of fraud and exploitation. Marcus Stone systematically deceived Mrs. Henderson about the value of her husband's assets while maneuvering to acquire those assets for himself. The judge turned to Ruth directly. Mrs. Henderson, I hereby declare all property transfers between your late husband's estate and Marcus Stone to be fraudulent and void. All rights, properties, and assets that belong to Samuel Henderson are returned to his legal heirs, yourself and your daughter Clara. The church erupted in applause and cheers. Clara tugged on her mother's skirt. Mama, does this mean we got Daddy's land back? Yes, sweetheart, Ruth said through tears of relief and vindication. It means we got everything back. But Judge Crawford wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the evidence of Mr. Stone's pattern of fraud affecting multiple families, I'm authorizing Sheriff Hayes to investigate all land transactions Stone has been involved in over the past decade. Any other victims of his schemes should present their cases for review. Elijah approached Ruth and Clara with a broad smile, the first genuinely happy expression she'd seen on his face since they'd met. Samuel would be so proud, he said quietly. His family's rights have been restored, and his memory has been vindicated. Our family's rights, Clara corrected him solemnly. You're part of our family now, aren't you, Mr. Elijah? Ruth felt her heart skip as she saw Elijah's expression soften with genuine emotion. If your mother will have me, he said, I'd be honored to be part of Samuel Henderson's family. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Ruth and Clara with congratulations and apologies. The same neighbors who had whispered about Elijah's motives now offered their respect and support, finally understanding that they had witnessed not scandal, but honor, a man keeping a sacred promise to a fallen friend. The legal battle was over, but Ruth knew the real victory was deeper than property rights or mineral claims. Samuel Henderson's true place in Millbrook's history had been restored, and his daughter would grow up knowing that her father had been not just a hero, but a founding father whose contributions had shaped the very community that now celebrated His memory, the celebration following Judge Crawford's ruling, was interrupted by the sound of a lone rider approaching the church at a dangerous gallop. Heads turned as Marcus Stone's dust-covered figure appeared at the edge of town. His horse lathered from hard riding, and his face twisted with desperate rage. "This isn't over," Stone shouted, dismounting roughly and pushing through the crowd toward the church steps. "You think you've won, but I've got something that'll change everything." Sheriff Hayes moved immediately to intercept him, hand resting on his gun. "Marcus, you're under arrest for fraud and theft. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not going anywhere until everyone hears the truth about your precious Samuel Henderson," Stone snarled, pulling a crumpled telegram from his coat pocket. "You want to know what kind of man you're celebrating? Read this." He thrust the telegram at Judge Crawford, who examined it with obvious skepticism. "This claims to be from a Confederate Veterans Association in Georgia. It alleges that Samuel Henderson was a deserter who stole military supplies." A gasp went through the crowd. Clara pressed closer to her mother, confused by the renewed tension. "It's a lie," Elijah said firmly, stepping forward. "Samuel Henderson served with honor and distinction. I have his complete military record." "Do you?" Stone challenged, his eyes wild with desperation. "Or do you just have the stories he told? How do you really know what happened during those war years when you weren't together?" Before Elijah could respond, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Because I was there." An elderly black man had emerged from the crowd, leaning heavily on a walking stick, but carrying himself with unmistakable dignity. Ruth gasped as she recognized him, Ezra Washington, who ran a small farm outside town and rarely came to public gatherings. "I served with Samuel Henderson in the 54th Massachusetts," Washington said, his weathered voice carrying clearly. "I was at Fort Wagner, at Charleston, at every engagement where that telegram claims he showed cowardice." Washington approached, Stone with slow, deliberate steps. "Son, I don't know who sent you that telegram, but they're lying. Samuel Henderson never deserted, never stole supplies, never showed anything but courage under fire. You're just covering for him because—" Stone began, but Washington cut him off. "Because nothing. I'm 73 years old, boy. I got no reason to lie about anything at this stage of my life." Washington turned to address the crowd. "Samuel Henderson saved my life at Petersburg. Could have run when the Confederates broke our line, but he stayed to help wounded men retreat. That's who Samuel Henderson was." Stone's face had gone from flushed to pale as his final weapon proved worthless. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that Morgan here has been lying to all of you for years, using false names, hiding his past. How can you trust anything he says?" "Because," Clara said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the adult arguments, "actions are louder than words." She walked up to Stone with no fear, her chin raised in a gesture that reminded everyone present of her father's. "Quiet dignity. Mr. Stone, you've spent weeks telling lies about Mama and me and Mr. Elijah. You stole from us and lied about it. But Mr. Elijah kept a promise to my daddy, even though it was hard and scary. Who should we believe? Someone who breaks promises or someone who keeps them?" The simple truth of a child's logic silenced Stone's protests. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, faces that had moved from curiosity to disgust to pity, and seemed to finally understand that his credibility was gone forever. Sheriff Hayes stepped forward with handcuffs. "Marcus Stone, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and theft. You have the right to—" "I know my rights," Stone muttered, allowing himself to be cuffed without further resistance. As Hayes led him away, he made one last desperate appeal. To the crowd, "You're all making a mistake. You'll see. Outsiders never care about communities like this. Morgan will take what he wants and leave, just like they all do." But no one was listening anymore. The community had heard enough lies from Marcus Stone to last several lifetimes. As the crowd began to disperse, Elijah approached Ruth and Clara with a folder of legal documents in his hands. "Ruth, there's one more thing that needs to be done," he said formally. The judge's ruling restored your family's rights, but there's additional property that should belong to Clara. What do you mean? Elijah opened the folder and withdrew a deed transfer document. When I purchased my ranch 5 years ago, part of that land originally belonged to Samuel through his founding member rights. Legally, it should have passed to his family when he died. Ruth stared at the documents. Elijah, that's thousands of acres of prime grazing land. You can't just— Yes, I can, Elijah interrupted gently. And I am. Clara Henderson deserves to inherit her father's vision of building something lasting in the West. He knelt down to Clara's level and handed her the deed. Clara, this document makes you the owner of some of the best ranch land in the territory. Your father dreamed of raising cattle and building a legacy for his family. Now you can make that dream come true. Clara examined the official-looking paper with wide eyes. But I'm just a little girl. I don't know how to run a ranch. You'll learn, Elijah smiled. And until you do, I'll help you manage it. Consider me your business partner, the way your father and I should have been partners if we'd had more time. Ruth felt tears streaming down her face as she watched this final act of devotion to Samuel's memory. Elijah, this is too much. Samuel expected me to make sure his family had every opportunity to succeed, Elijah said firmly. This is me keeping that promise, Ruth. This is me making sure Clara grows up knowing that her father's dreams weren't forgotten. Tom Morrison stepped forward from the crowd, his hat in his hands. Mrs. Henderson, Miss Clara, I'd be honored to serve as foreman for the Henderson Ranch if you'll have me. The Henderson Ranch? Clara asked. That's what we'll call it, Elijah confirmed, after the man who earned it. As the sun set over Millbrook that evening, Clara Henderson stood on the steps of the church, holding the deed to a ranch that would secure her future and honor her father's memory. Around her, neighbors who had once whispered about her family now offered congratulations and support. But more than property or money, Clara had gained something invaluable. The knowledge that her father's honor had been restored, his memory protected, and his dreams for his family finally realized through the faithfulness of a friend who had never forgotten a promise made in war. 6 months after Judge Crawford's ruling, Clara Henderson walked confidently across the Millbrook schoolyard, wearing a pair of beautiful brown leather boots that fit her perfectly and showed no signs of wear or desperation. The boots had been a gift from Elijah, but more than that, they represented everything that had changed in her young life: the restoration of her father's honor, the security of her family's future, and the knowledge that she was loved and protected by an entire community. Ruth watched from the window of her new shop, established in the building that had once housed Marcus Stone's fraudulent land office. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in town that the Henderson family tailoring business now operated from the very space where Stone had schemed to steal from vulnerable families. Ruth's enterprise thrived, not just because of her skill with needle and thread, but because the community had embraced her family with a warmth and respect that would have seemed impossible a year ago. Mrs. Henderson? Jenny Walsh peered around the shop door, her arms full of fabric. Mama sent me with material for 3 new dresses. She says business is good enough that we can afford pretty things now. Ruth smiled at the girl who had been among the first to benefit from Elijah's quiet kindness. Come in, Jenny. Let's see what your mother has chosen. As Ruth examined the cheerful cotton prints, a far cry from the practical but drab fabrics that had been all most families could afford, she reflected on how much had changed for everyone in Millbrook. The recovery of Samuel's founding member rights had meant more than just land and water for the Henderson family. It had forced the entire community to reckon with its history and its prejudices. The Henderson Ranch, managed jointly by Elijah and Tom Morrison, had become one of the territory's most successful operations. But more importantly, it employed men of all backgrounds at equal wages and treated everyone with the same respect. Other ranchers had begun to follow suit, realizing that fairness was not only morally right, but also good business. Through the window, Ruth could see Clara organizing a game of jump rope with several other children. The same children who had once mocked her worn boots now competed for her friendship, drawn by her natural leadership and generous spirit. Tommy Mitchell, his cruel streak tempered by genuine remorse, had become one of Clara's closest friends. "Clara's really changed since last fall," Jenny observed, following Ruth's gaze. "She's more confident, but she's also kinder somehow. Like she understands things the rest of us don't." Ruth nodded, understanding exactly what Jenny meant. Clara had learned lessons about justice, forgiveness, and human nature that most adults never fully grasped. The experience of being defended, having her father's honor restored, and watching a community transform itself had given her a wisdom that went far beyond her 9 years. A commotion in the schoolyard caught their attention. A new family had recently arrived in Millbrook, Mexican immigrants fleeing violence in their homeland, traveling with little more than the clothes on their backs and hopes for a better life. Their son, Miguel, was about Clara's age, but spoke little English and owned no shoes at all. Ruth watched as several children began pointing and whispering about Miguel's bare feet, the same cruel dynamic she'd witnessed countless times before. Her heart tightened, remembering Clara's humiliation just months earlier. But instead of joining the mockers or simply ignoring the situation, Clara walked directly to Miguel with calm determination. She knelt down, examined his feet with the same gentle concern Elijah had shown for her broken boot, then stood and addressed the other children with quiet authority. "Miguel's family just got here from very far away," she said clearly. "They had to leave everything behind to keep safe. Making fun of him for not having shoes is like making fun of someone for being brave enough to start over." The children looked ashamed, remembering their own behavior from the previous year and how it had been judged by the entire community. "Besides," Clara continued, "bare feet aren't shameful. My daddy told Mama that some of the bravest soldiers he knew couldn't afford proper boots, but still marched hundreds of miles to fight for what was right." Tommy Mitchell stepped forward, looking genuinely contrite. "Miguel, I'm sorry we were staring. Would you like to play with us?" Ruth felt tears sting her eyes as she watched her daughter create the inclusive, welcoming environment that she herself had longed for during their darkest days. Clara had learned not just to receive kindness, but to give it, and to do so with the same graceful dignity that had characterized her father. From across the street, Elijah Morgan observed the scene with obvious pride. He'd been coming to town more frequently lately, no longer the mysterious, distant figure he'd once been. The revelation of his true identity and his connection to Samuel had transformed him from an outsider into one of Millbrook's most respected citizens. "She's got Samuel's heart," he said quietly to Ruth as she emerged from her shop to watch the children include Miguel in their games. "And your sense of justice," Ruth replied. "You both taught her that protecting others is more important than protecting yourself." They stood together in comfortable companionship, two adults who had found in each other not romance, but something deeper and more lasting. A shared commitment to honoring Samuel Henderson's memory and raising his daughter with the values he had died defending. As the afternoon wore on, Clara appeared at Ruth's side with grass stains on her new dress and dirt on her perfect boots, signs of a childhood being lived fully and joyfully. "Mama, Miguel's family doesn't have enough money for shoes yet. Can we help them somehow? Maybe I could give him my old boots that I outgrew." Ruth smiled at her daughter's generous impulse. "Those old boots were thrown away months ago, sweetheart. But I think we can find another solution." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table in their comfortable home on the recovered Henderson property, Clara presented her latest drawing, a sketch of Miguel playing with the other children, his bare feet forgotten in the joy of acceptance and friendship. "I want to remember today," she explained, "because it's the first time I got to be the helper instead of the one who needed help." Ruth studied the drawing, seeing in it not just her daughter's artistic skill, but her understanding of life's essential truth, that kindness received must become kindness given, that dignity restored must become dignity shared, and that the love of a community must flow outward to embrace each new soul seeking refuge and hope. Outside their window, the lights of Millbrook twinkled in the gathering dusk, each one representing a family, a dream, a story of struggle and survival. Some of those families had been there for generations, others had arrived just days before. But all of them were part of something larger now, a community that had learned to judge people by their character rather than their circumstances, their contributions rather than their origins. Samuel Henderson's legacy lived on not just in the land records and legal documents that bore his name, but in the transformed heart of a town that had rediscovered its founding principles through the courage of his daughter and the faithfulness of his friend. Sometimes, Ruth reflected, the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property, but the knowledge that goodness existed in the world, and that each person had the power to either nurture it or destroy it. Clara Henderson had chosen to nurture it just as her father would have wanted, just as Elijah had shown her, and just as their community had finally learned to do. The little girl with the broken boots had become a young woman with an unbreakable spirit, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring with her father's dignity, her mother's strength, and the love of a town that had finally learned to live up to its highest ideals.